This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 764 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. I touched on this last week on the mailbag episode, but the projections building process is not some automated thing where you click a button and everything's magically built. There's definitely that idea out there. There are things that you've got to do manually with your projections. A lot of things. Now, everyone's going to build projections in a different way. Some people do all of it manually. Some of them just eyeball things. That's not really my approach, though. For me, like I said last week, I have some formulas that I use to help me get team level numbers. So I start at the team level first. Those include pass and rush attempts that are based on projected pass rates. And then once the team level numbers are set, I go to quarterbacks and I start to project their stat lines. And then once that's finished, we've got even more high level numbers that we can divvy up between running back, wide receiver, and tight end. For those skill position players, my projections are based on target share and rush share. Meaning some team is projected for some number of pass attempts and rush attempts. Those pass attempts get converted into targeted attempts. And those targeted attempts are handed out to players based on their projected target share. And then the rush attempts are divided up and they're given to players based on those players' projected rush share. The volume aspect is so important to projection building because fantasy football is built on volume. So once we have those volume numbers, we can do a little regression analysis, some historical analysis, and find efficiency numbers for every single player. That's going to drive their total yards. And that can help us then figure out how many touchdowns a player is going to score. Now, there are inputs in there that I obviously didn't just talk about. But that's the gist of how my projections are built. If you want like a 1-minute rundown. And those projections are currently built for the 2023 fantasy season. Now, I do this episode each year, but I like to take notes when I'm building these projections. Because when you sit down and you start to look at depth charts in more detail, you can uncover some things that you might not have otherwise uncovered. Now, to be clear, I don't draft strictly off of my projections, but I think the process of building projections can be really, really helpful in seeing the range of outcomes for a particular player. So today I'm going to go over some of the most important items that I noted when building projections this year. Now, before getting into those things, I just want to send another reminder to check out the Late Round Prospect Guide and the Late Round Draft Guide over on lateround.com. The Prospect Guide is all finished and it's ready to help you win your rookie drafts. The Draft Guide is in pre-order mode. That draft guide, which is for your season-long leagues, will be sent out on June 30th. You can read more about it over on lateround.com. I think one of the biggest stories of this fantasy football season is going to be on a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and that's the early round quarterbacks. I promise you, this offseason, I'm going to get into the game theory aspect of things with quarterbacks. It'll be in the draft guide. I'll likely do an episode on it. Don't worry. But I do want to touch on Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, and Josh Allen. I'm not sure people realize how rare 2022 was. When you look at all quarterbacks since 2011 who played at least 8 games, 2022 featured 3 of the top 10 quarterback seasons in points per game that we've seen. Hurts, Mahomes, and Allen all had top 10 scores over the last 12 seasons. Meanwhile, and this is arbitrary, but it helps illustrate the point, but all the while, the QB6 last year, a mid-range QB1 in a 12-team league, that QB6 scored 19.8 points per game. That was the 5th best QB6 average since 2011. So it was a little bit above average. When you go down and look at the QB12, that QB12 last year scored a little over 17 points per game. And that was the 7th best mark by a QB12 since 2011. Meaning they had a below average score. So at a high level, what that tells us is that the big 3 quarterbacks, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, and Josh Allen, they were all giving you a really big advantage. They were all high-end quarterbacks. During the last 12 years, they had top 10 numbers in points per game. But then the rest of the position was basically average at best. Some parts of it were below average. These numbers naturally tend to regress. When a player scores a whole lot of fantasy points, it's usually because something went right for him during that season. And that's what we've seen historically. Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, and Patrick Mahomes each scored over 24 fantasy points per game last year. Among quarterbacks with 8 or more games played, that's only occurred 8 other times since 2011. Now, of those 8 other instances, every single one of them saw their points per game drop the following year by at least a point. 7 of the 8 saw a drop by at least 2.9 points. And the average drop in points per game was 4.6. Now, this is not how my projections are built. This is just an example of natural regression. It's hard to maintain greatness. I'm bringing this all up because projections show this regression. That's part of the reason they can be useful. And my projections currently see none of those quarterbacks getting over 24 points per game this season. And if and when that drop occurs, as long as the baseline players stay the same, then those 3 quarterbacks become less valuable than they were a season ago. Now, the drop in projected fantasy points doesn't mean that they're bound to score fewer points. I think it's likely that they do, but it's not a guarantee. These are projections. But also, it doesn't mean that you should fade them at ADP necessarily. Like I said, I'll do more analysis on this topic during the offseason. What it does mean is that if you're assuming the edge is going to be the same as last year, I think that's being a little bit too hopeful. I still have those 3 quarterbacks as the top 3 in fantasy football, and they're still giving people an advantage. And as I've brought up on this show over the last handful of years, the quarterback position is also becoming more predictable than it used to be. So you can feel good about those players being the guys who are giving you an edge. Back in like 2015, 2016, that was not the case at all. That was like peak late round quarterbacking. But the important takeaway here is that we can't assume the same edge is going to occur here in 2023. We should probably bet against that. Now, that was more of a macro view on things. Let's dig into something more specific. Let's look at the Atlanta Falcons offense. One thing that does fluctuate year over year is pass rate. It generally regresses. And the Falcons had a bottom 5 pass rate since 2011 last year. That's almost definitely going to rise in 2023, even if they drafted Bijan Robinson. It's just how this stuff generally goes. With that being said, they're still going to be a run-heavy team, and that's a real problem for both Kyle Pitts and Drake London. Now, I love both of those players as talents. I think Drake London is a cornerstone-type wide receiver for Dynasty. But for 2023, I'm not as bullish as you might think. Now, the Falcons don't have a lot of competition for targets, so London and Pitts could easily end up seeing 50% of the team's targets this year. Let's get that out of the way first. But one thing we have to remember with London was that last year, he had a stretch of games without Kyle Pitts. When Pitts played, London had a 26.5% target share per game, which is fantastic, especially for a rookie. The Falcons were also pretty run-heavy during that stretch, and he averaged 5.9 targets per game with Kyle Pitts. Now, without Kyle Pitts, the Falcons aired it out a little bit more, of course. They went from a 41% pass rate to a 45% pass rate. And while that was happening, Drake London ended up seeing a nice uptick in target share because Kyle Pitts was not in that lineup. His target share went from 26.5% all the way up to over 33% per game. So that 33% per game rate was on a pass-heavier team, and that resulted in 8.7 targets per game. So London went from 5.9 targets per game with Kyle Pitts to 8.7 without him. That's pretty substantial. The issue is that Kyle Pitts is now healthy again. So London's target share is not going to be 33%. So there's a chance that his overall volume number in this offense for 2023 is not that dramatically different than what we saw from him last year, where he had 117 targets. I've got him for about 10 more targets than that. Now here's the good news. People don't seem to be paying for London as if he's going to maintain that 33% rate. He's a low-end wide receiver 2 in early best ball drafts, and that's where my projections have him. And you can make the argument that he's a value there, because the Falcons have way more room to grow in terms of being a pass-heavier team than a run-heavier one. Just be aware that the volume problem, even with regression, has not disappeared for this Falcons offense. And you could say similar things about Chicago. We've seen quarterbacks take big leaps from one year to the next over the last handful of seasons, and it's often come after that quarterback gets a new weapon. Josh Allen got Stephon Diggs in 2020, and he became the quarterback he is today. Jalen Hurts got A.J. Brown last year. Boom, a near MVP season. People naturally think that this could happen with Justin Fields because the Bears added DJ Moore. And I like Fields. I was on him last year for a reason. But we really shouldn't make an assumption like this. In 2019, the year before Josh Allen really broke out, He had a .02 expected points per dropback rate, according to Number Fire's expected points metric. His success rate was 42.5%. He had a PFF passing grade of 61. In 2021, the year before Jalen Hurts' big season, his expected points per dropback was .08. His success rate was 44%. Those aren't terrible numbers. And he had a 69 passing grade on PFF. So Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts had positive expected points per dropback rates. Their success rates were 42.5% and 44%. Justin Fields last year had a minus .17 expected points per dropback rate and a 38% success rate. PFF gave him a 54 passing grade. So to put this all another way, we probably shouldn't just generalize here and say that Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts are the same thing as Justin Fields. Unfortunately, Justin Fields has not been the same type of passer. Now, we should expect advancement with his passing, of course. It's not like he's had good weapons in a good situation. But even with that, the Bears are almost definitely going to be a run-heavy team. I mentioned how run-heavy Atlanta was last year. Chicago was the absolute most run-heavy team since 2011. And maybe even beyond. I just went back to 2011. They're going to throw more this year, but we should still expect them to be a run-heavy team. And that combination of questionable passing from a projection standpoint, along with decent enough competition at pass catcher and low passing volume, means that DJ Moore looks pretty overrated right now. My projections have him as a wide receiver 3 in fantasy. He's currently getting drafted as a top 20 wide receiver. I just can't get there right now. My thing is that if DJ Moore is going to have this great season and really live up to ADP and far exceed ADP, and it's going to happen in what's probably going to be a bottom half offense and pass rate, just draft Justin Fields. If DJ Moore blows up, you'll still have exposure to that. And if he doesn't, it doesn't mean that Fields has a bad season. Because we know that his value, Justin Fields' value, has to do with rushing. I'll be honest, I've got concerns about Jonathan Taylor. Not that I think he's going to fall off the face of the earth because he's Jonathan Taylor, but the Anthony Richardson thing is not necessarily good for his fantasy production. He definitely has a shot to be more efficient, and that's reflected in his projection. But efficiency only gets you so far in fantasy football. The issue with Taylor is that if Richardson is the quarterback, we could see limited use as a pass catcher, and we could see fewer opportunities at the goal line, which is huge. Those are two of the most important things for a running back in fantasy football. Taylor's now played 3 years in the league. His max target share per game rate has been 10.5%. You could make the argument that the Colts have just been this run-heavy team, and that's why Taylor's not seeing a lot of looks through the air. A 10% target share looks a lot better in Kansas City than Indianapolis. And that's true. But are we expecting them to get more pass heavy with a rookie quarterback who's as athletic as Anthony Richardson is? Mobile quarterbacks tend to not dump it off as much to running backs. I did a study on that a few years ago, episode 510. But not only that, Richardson will now take up a higher rush share on the ground than previous Colts quarterbacks. And that touchdown equity is going to be divvied up more too. Now, it's not the end of the world for Jonathan Taylor. But when you're drafting early, when you're in the first round of your fantasy draft, you kind of need to be this particular with players. All of the players that you're choosing from are good. And situationally, I think people see Anthony Richardson, see that he's probably an upgrade for that Colts offense, and just assume that that means great things for Jonathan Taylor. But it doesn't automatically mean that. Now, my projections still have Jonathan Taylor as a top 10 running back this year, but he's not in the top 3 range for me. There are some red flags for him at the moment. You probably won't regret drafting Jonathan Taylor because of who he is, but I just wouldn't force it. Travis Etienne and Kenneth Walker both saw day 2 running backs get drafted to their backfield this year, and I think there's reason to not be very bullish on them as a result. Post-draft, Kenneth Walker's best ball ADP is in the RB15 range, which I do think that you can give him a little bit of a bump because of the best ball format. Not only is he a big play threat, but you have outs to him still being a workhorse back. Maybe Zach Charbonnet just doesn't pan out. Maybe he gets hurt, and then Walker would have that top 8 or so running back upside. If we assume that Walker maintains that kind of ADP in regular season-long leagues, though, I'm probably going to be out. My projections have him as a lower-end RB2, largely because I'm not sure where the pass catching is going to come from. He saw a 7.5% target share per game rate last year when he took over as starter. This year, now he's got Zach Charbonnet to deal with, and they drafted Jackson Smith and Jigba. As long as everyone's healthy, it's tough to see him getting a lot of looks through the air. Since 2011, we've seen 3 running backs in half PPR leagues finish as a top 10 running back in points per game while hitting a target share per game rate under 6%. That's among all players who played 8 or more games. Each of those players scored 12 or more touchdowns on the ground. If there is not an injury, I think it's going to be hard for Walker to hit a high ceiling. Now, weekly variance and that weekly upside, that's still going to be there. But on a season-long level, it's a tougher sell. And then with Travis Etienne, you could project Etienne for a very similar role as he had last year when he took over that backfield from James Robinson, and he still doesn't look great. He had a 7% target share per game rate last year without Robinson. His rush share was great. But again, having that target share is important. And now they've got Tank Bigsby. Bigsby is more of a threat to Etienne than anyone that they had in that backfield last year. And the team openly talked about adding more pieces to that backfield this offseason. So they went out and they got Tank Bigsby. So like Walker, my projections still see Etienne as more of a lower end RB2 rather than a borderline RB1. In my opinion, you definitely have to do a little bit of projecting for Etienne to hit that RB1 mark. Because he didn't have a receiving role last year. It at least wasn't robust. And with more weapons in that offense, I'm not sure that we can lock him into a 10, 11% target share that's probably necessary for him to be an RB1 in fantasy. I know that people are understandably concerned about Tyler Lockett and the Seahawks offense after the team drafted Jackson Smith-Njigba. But I think specifically in 2023, Lockett might be a value once again. Now, I work with historical ADP data, and that average draft position data helps me generate expected fantasy points. So at a certain point in a draft, a wide receiver or a running back or a tight end, they have some sort of points per game number that they're expected to score. Like the 50th overall pick at wide receiver might be expected to score 12 or 13 PPR points per game. That's just a random example. You can then look at expected points per game and subtract it from a player's actual points per game to find out how valuable that player ended up being. And there are some instances where trends emerge for individual players. Tyler Lockett is a perfect example. The market almost always hates him. And I know that because he's played below ADP expectation just twice in 8 years. He actually hasn't been below his points per game expectation since 2017. And right now, when I compare my projections to what the market is saying at wide receiver, Tyler Lockett once again pops up as one of the best values. Just because Jackson Smith-Njigba is there doesn't mean Tyler Lockett's going to start seeing a 14% target share in that offense. Chances are, especially at the start of the season, JSN's not going to be on the field in 2 wide receiver sets. It was one of the rare places in the first round that he could have landed where that would be the case. Tyler Lockett himself is good at football. Good players get targets because targets are earned. So he's still looking like a pretty firm wide receiver 3 in my projections when he goes later than that in drafts. And there's upside with a player like Lockett too, because DK Metcalf or JSN could end up getting hurt. Basically, I think my overall point is that the gap between DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett should probably not be as significant as it currently is. That's what my projections show, at least. Now, I just talked about Jackson Smith-Njigba. His projection doesn't look as good as it could have looked in a different environment, at least for 2023. But I want to make a note about him and just in general on today's episode. Rookie wide receivers have been pretty good investments in redraft leagues over the last handful of years. That was something I talked about at length on episode 647. The thing with rookie wide receivers, though, and you could argue this for any rookie, is that they don't always look that great with projections. Even last year, players like Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, on the projections front, they were like wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5s. I mean, that's where people were drafting them too. Christian Watson and George Pickens were even lower than that. But they end up working out at a much higher rate than you would think. Or at least some of these guys do. Especially if they're middle round picks in redraft. Largely because they can get off to slower starts and they really come through during the second half of your fantasy season. And that's the most important time of year. So their season-long numbers don't necessarily look as good as they actually are, how valuable they actually are. Now, we may not see a ton of higher-end picks spent on rookie wideouts this year. And I can tell you that a lot of these guys don't project that well. But they'll likely do well. They'll do better than you expect. More than likely. That's what we've seen, at least. Jordan Addison is the one that my projections like the most. And he's the one who should be drafted first among this group, in my opinion. But don't let a crowded situation pull you away entirely from a rookie wide receiver. Injuries happen and talent emerges. We see that happen each and every year. Now, the last thing I want to bring up on today's show has to do with two running backs who may not be in the best offenses in the world, but they're not set up all that poorly for production here in 2023. The first is James Conner. The Cardinals really don't have a ton of depth behind Conner. His projection still doesn't look unbelievable because the general offensive situation isn't that great. Kyler Murray's coming off that ACL. And his projection's pretty in line with what the market is saying about Conner right now. But there's also room for growth here. That projection is under the assumption that Kyler Murray is not fully healthy, and that the Cardinals' offense is more of a bottom half or a bottom quarter type offense. And Conner himself is still not hitting the rush share ceiling that he might be able to hit within that projection. So he's still a low-end RB2, but there is some room for growth there. But the player I think who's more intriguing here is Cam Akers. It's easy to forget, but Cam Akers balled out down the stretch last year. Over his final 6 games of 2022, he ranked 8th, 25th, 20th, 1st, 14th, and 11th in weekly PPR scoring. He averaged 17.4 PPR points per game. And what's most important and promising is that he was actually seeing some work through the air. He had target shares of 15%, 7%, 11%, and 13% over his final 4 games. That's not something that we'd really seen from him or this Rams offense. And if you look at that Rams offense today, there's not a whole lot going on. Their pass catchers are weak behind Cooper Kupp. They're at least unproven. And the backfield is the same exact way. Now, maybe Zach Evans becomes something, who knows? But he was still a day 3 pick. He didn't have a great collegiate profile. He's not a big back. He's not much of a receiver. And not only was he a day 3 pick, but Evans was the Rams' 3rd pick of the 6th round. My projections are fairly bullish on Cam Akers this year. I'm not sure the ceiling is like a top 5 ceiling, but if he gets drafted as a high-end RB3 or a low-end RB2, he can definitely beat that ADP. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Greatly appreciate it. I'll talk to you later in the week.